Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. This week I want to talk about being overwhelmed. And this is something that happens increasingly in our lives, given how much is going on. Of course, coming through a pandemic, and in addition to the events of the pandemic and all that surrounded the pandemic, there's what continues to go on in political circles, internationally and nationally, depending on where you are. And within that, of course, there is a sense of instability. People are trying to figure out, what career they can have, how long they can have their career for, how stable their career is. If for people who have kids, they're thinking about their kids and what careers and lives they will have and stability for their family. And overall, there's this sense of complete and utter exhaustion that arises. Now, what do? We have a sense that we want to not be overwhelmed. We have a sense that we want to feel safe and secure. We, of course, want to find ways that can help us as we move forward in life. Yet, time and time again, it seems like the efforts and the things that we do often come up against this brick wall, and there is a kind of exhaustion that sets over us that is like an overcast day. And although there may be moments where light peeks through the clouds, we do recognize that we will return to this feeling of this overcast day. So what do we do when we feel overwhelmed? Well, I struggle with this because I think for myself, there is a part of me that wants to try and understand and fix and know and find a solution. There's a part of me that thinks there must be a way out of this. There must be a key I can find that can in some way help me to, lift my spirits or to find the right way through a situation, to get myself to more stable ground. And there are periods of time that occur where I do find a place that I can say, okay, I'm feeling good. Yet they don't last. There's always this change in the air. There's always this sense that things can fall apart. There's always this feeling that whatever it is that I know and is bringing me a sense of security, that this knowing is time limited, is going to occur for a certain duration, whatever that duration is, and then end. So what's happening when I'm facing this feeling of being overwhelmed? What's happening when I'm facing this experience where I feel unsure as to what and where and how I can do and live my life? Perhaps the first question to ask, and perhaps the first thing to acknowledge, is that the need for stability is an innate need. That we're not wrong to want to feel safe, to feel like the steps that we are taking in our life will be on firm ground. Yet, we do also want things to change in our life. We do want meaning. We do want to take a sense of accomplishment from the things that we do, feel like we are contributing, feel like we are succeeding, and whatever that is to us. So there is this dynamic pull that we want to do better. Yet, when we're overwhelmed, what seems to be happening is the natural need to want to do better, to strive, to grow, and so on, is out of balance with the amount of change that is occurring in our life. So what this means is we're being asked to do, to change, to transform at a higher rate than we can actually handle. What then happens, or what then can happen, and what I see often happening, is the person then puts it on themselves, saying, in effect, well, I guess I should figure out how to handle this. I should figure out how to deal with the added things that are necessary because of all that's happening in life. I just have to find a way to manage that. And what that does structurally is it puts a greater impetus on you as an individual to handle these social and cultural changes that are happening, and they're happening in a way that is exponentially increasing. So it's easy for us to say and easy for us to see how the information flood is overwhelming. So if I said to you, okay, listen, let's pretend you don't have to go to work for a week, and your sole job will be all you do each and every day is just get up, and your one thing is just to try and keep on top of the news feeds that you have, whatever they are. That in and of itself, you would not be able to do. You would not be able to keep on top of the information, fact check the information, and then engage in the information. Maybe you would journal about it. Maybe you'd meet up with some friends and talk about it. Maybe you'd find people who have different opinions and then you'd explore that. You would not be able to, in a meaningful way, actually take in the information with any kind of depth at all, even if that was your job. So it's not your job, right? In addition to taking in whatever information you're taking in about what's going on in the world, what's going on in your community, you're also managing your life, your livelihood, paying rent, paying bills. If you have kids, dealing with all the things that are going on with your children. If you're going through a separation or a divorce, all the things that are going on with that. If you're dealing with a career change and perhaps you're going through some retraining, then of course you're dealing with that. Illness in the family, then you're dealing with that. In other words, all of the things that are happening in life are ongoing. And even if we put a pin in all of those things, none of us could, in a really substantive, meaningful way, get to the bottom of, for example, taking in all of the news that's coming in. So it's like a casino, right? It's stacked against you. Yet we feel that we are supposed to, in some way, manage all of these things that, even in this little example of us saying, okay, for 1 week, all we're doing is reading the news and meaningfully engaging in it, and we can't do it. Even when we break it out like that and we realize, oh yeah, that actually isn't possible. It isn't possible for us. We don't actually have enough time. So to think that I can somehow create time, I can somehow, as if to say, I can create extra hours in the day, extra days in the week, and extra months in the year. Well, that's not true, right? It's not true, yet we believe it. And we believe it because look at our actions. And so I'm wondering if we can think about the feeling of being overwhelmed as the canary in the coal mine. In other words, it's saying something to us about being overwhelmed. That is to say that there's something dangerous going on, that we have crossed a saturation point. And it is no longer, you can think of it in ecological terms, it's no longer a sustainable use of our resources, right? That we are trying to draw out more from our lived life, right? Our manifest life, than is actually possible, right? Because of the number of hours in the day, the physical strength we have, the amount of cognitive time we have to think about things, all of that is limited. And we are trying to, in whatever way, convince ourselves that we can cross that line to then get to, and that's where the big blank is. So what are we actually doing? Well, we can say, well, I want to be successful, and I want to have meaning, and I want to have purpose, and I want to save the world, and I want to conquer the world, and whatever it is that we say. But fundamentally, what we're saying is we want to control the thing and the things that are overwhelming to us. We want other people to do things the way we want. We want other people to aspire to and adhere to our beliefs. We want, in whatever way, our constructed notion of a world and the order of that world, which we deem as being safe, reasonable, and all the rest of it, we want them to adhere to that. in a sense, we think it's easier to change the world than it is to change ourselves. That our perspective in the way we think is so fixed that it's easier to change our partner's mind, our coworker's mind, the politician's mind. It's easier to change everybody else's mind except ours. And when we can't, we become, dramatic pause, overwhelmed. So this feeling of being overwhelmed is telling us something, right? It's telling us that there's these worlds colliding, right? That I have a view and I meet somebody and I just cannot believe that they think the way they think. I am utterly shocked that they think in that way. And I'm around them for a certain period of time. Could be 1 minute, could be 10 minutes, could be an hour, whatever it is. And through this experience of exhaustion that I am constantly trying to defend my worldview against their worldview leaves me feeling exhausted, leaves me feeling overwhelmed. So how do we address an issue where our worldview has smashed into the worldview of somebody else? And the result of that is we feel overwhelmed. And then, of course, compound that. Right? We don't just talk to one person each day. We don't just deal with one issue each day. So you work in an environment. Let's say it's a relatively toxic environment. So you have issues with management that are overwhelming. You have issues with coworkers that are overwhelming. Then, of course, you travel to work. So you take, TTC, public transportation, or you take a highway or a road or whatever it is. And so there's other people, other cars, all the rest of it. That's overwhelming. Then you have to pick up groceries. Something goes wrong. A teller closes. All this kind of stuff changes. And you think, okay, well, that's overwhelming. So here's one way to kind of approach this. And it's a bit of an inversion. So what I'm going to suggest we do, and this is kind of a thought experiment, is let's start seeing the feeling of being overwhelmed not as something that's happening to us from outside, but something that is internally happening that's letting us know something. Now, the way in which we're interpreting it is to say they are wrong, right? The cashier that closed out just before I was bringing my cart, she or he is wrong, right? The driver that cut me off when I was driving home from work, she or he is wrong. Similarly, with all of the different people, she or he or they are wrong. Now, what if that feeling we're having, and again, this is a kind of a thought experiment, so we'll come into this and step out of it, but getting into this, what if that feeling we're having is letting us know too much? This whole thing is too much. We think, well, I can't quit my job, I can't not buy groceries, I can't do all of these things. But a part of you is almost like a child saying, yeah, I don't care about any of that, it's too much. So I'm suggesting here that the experience of being overwhelmed is a part of our individual needs, which are being exacerbated and overwhelmed to such a degree that we feel lost. Hence, we feel overwhelmed. However, is there a way for us to say, okay, the cashier at the grocery store isn't really against me? Then we say, okay, they're not really against me, so maybe we feel a bit better. What if we say the cashier is really against me? Right? That they looked me in the eye and they saw that I was coming and they had a smirk on their face as they put up next, cash please. Even so, even if they directed their anger and their feelings of being overwhelmed and their frustration and all the rest of it in that act of putting up the next cashier sign, even if they did, what does that actually mean? What choice do you have in your response? And what I'm finding increasingly with this experience of being overwhelmed, because for so many years I've thought, well, if I could just find this way, or figure out a career in a certain way, or get to a certain place in a career, or get set up in a certain way, a home or whatever it is, then everything will be okay. But what I've noticed is, as I'm 49 coming up on 50, is I've repeated that narrative a lot. So much so that it simply cannot be true, right? I've repeated it too many times to myself to actually believe anymore that the answer is the answer, that there is such a thing as the answer. So as I get older, I start to think, well, this must be something other than a fixed thing, a fixed answer. There must be something else going on here, which led me to think, well, what if it's a process? What if, like the seasons, like lapping water, like an in-breath followed by an out-breath, what if we're talking about a cycle and we're moving through known to unknown, known to unknown, known to unknown? And what if I can embrace that cycle? Not just trying to get half the cycle, not just trying to get the known part, but say, well, what if I can get known and then recognize, okay, this is an unknown, back to known, recognize this is unknown, I feel scared, I feel triggered, and it's important to make a distinction between triggers and actual dangers, right? So you can be triggered by something and there is no actual threat, yet the trigger is letting you know there's a threat, and you can, if it's not actually a dangerous situation, talk yourself down. Similarly, if we look at this experience at the grocery store and the cashier who looked us in the eye and smiled as they put the next cash sign up, in that moment, they are, and we might be entirely projecting this, right? We might be entirely creating this reality. They may have smirked, or they may have done those things, but what they meant was have a nice day, or they meant something totally different. But we interpreted what they did as being something against us. If we see that as being against us and we recognize, okay, I've now moved into the unknown. I moved into this response of frustration, danger, uncertainty. I don't know what's going on. I had this idea that I was going to go up to the cash, get my groceries, and I would be home in time. And now that's not going to happen. So now I am in the sphere of the unknown. And when I'm in the unknown, I become angry, I become afraid, I become whatever it is I become. And I'm feeling that on my body. The temperature, the heart rate, I might perspire, my face might grimace. I might do all of these different things. If we can recognize and acknowledge that we are having that experience in that moment, that we are actually going through the in-breath and out-breath, we are going through the night and day, the lapping water, whatever cycle you'd like to think of it as, that we start to move from this sense of overwhelming, or being overwhelmed rather, to a sense that, okay, this is actually a part of a cycle, right? This is a part of an experience. And so the person who cut me off on the road, or the person who's on a public transportation and, they're talking loud on their phone, whatever it is that they're doing, whatever it is that's happening, that we have a choice that we can make, and we can engage that choice based upon, okay, I'm feeling unknown right now. And when I feel unknown, and the unknowing experience of uncertainty, that things could fall apart, that the idea I had of this situation, which was a situation that I thought was good, it meant I felt safe. It also meant that I had an order to the universe. I had an order to the way my day was going to go. The structure of it has now been pulled apart, and we go, okay, yes, it has been pulled apart because another world has crashed into my world. That's why it's falling apart, because the worldview I have is no longer the only worldview that's going on right now. And so recognizing that that's what's happening, that's what's going on, that's what I'm experiencing. I'm experiencing this crisis that the world as I understand it is not the world that is. And that feeling is overwhelming. It is simply overwhelming when your world is coming to an end. So how do we live our lives acknowledging that, yes, there are these feelings that the world is coming to an end. However, is that a part of a cycle? So what I notice is the amount of energy that goes into the crisis of the world coming to an end. Now, this is for a really important evolutionary reason. It's a part of our wiring, so to speak. And what that means is real danger needs to have a real significance to us so we can avoid or not do the things that have a catastrophic potentiality for our existence. So if something scares me and stops me from doing something that could kill me, right, that's helpful from an evolutionary standpoint. Yet those responses that I have, that triggering, is not necessarily a proportional response to the cashier putting up a next cash sign, or the person on the public transportation talking on their phone, or the coworker not bringing the thing they said they were going to bring on time. These are actually not life-threatening situations, right? Yet we feel, because we move into the realm of uncertainty, because, well, I was going to do my groceries in a certain amount of time, I was going to do some reading on the way home on the public transportation, and the person talking on the phone is completely distracting me. At work, I was going to get this thing done in a certain amount of time because then I can move on to this next thing, but they've delayed their thing, so now that screws me up for my next thing. All of that is about our security/insecurity. All of that is about, we have an idea that's going to balance, and like I started off this podcast saying, it's going to balance off the fact that we need to do more in a day than we can. We need to do more in a week than is possible. And we need to add more to a year in terms of the number of months than there actually exists in a year. This suggests that we are internalizing more than is really fair for us to carry. That we are creating this burden because there is this underlying fear that we are alone, and if we don't do it, we're in trouble. And imagine for a moment, if we're constantly in this state that if we don't do it, we're in trouble. What kind of a state of mind is that? How much, if you think of it like a garden, how comfortable can we be, right? How stable can we feel? And if, as I'm talking about this idea of being overwhelmed, and now I'm talking about this idea of stability, you might be asking, well, how do those actually connect? Those don't seem to make a lot of sense to talk about them at the same time. How can I be overwhelmed and stable? Well, of course we can't, but the question is, and this is what I was mentioning earlier about this idea of being overwhelmed and starting to see it as an indicator of something. Is there something that we are facing? And this is something that I'm asking myself, so I'm positing this. I'm not suggesting this is, 5 steps to not being overwhelmed, but it's something that I'm thinking about, that am I choosing a life? Am I engaging in a life? Am I living a life that adds to the feeling of overwhelmed? In other words, what can I do to try and mitigate the experience of being overwhelmed? Now, of course, quite rightly, a person will say, I have kids, I have these jobs, the job is not very good, there's going to be all this stuff going on, my car breaks down all the time, or, whatever the problems are, and there are many, all of those are 100% real, obviously. We are thrown into the world, and we have to manage within the world that we are thrown into. So I'm not suggesting that we pretend that the environment we're thrown into, we pretend that the person talking on the phone beside us is not talking on the phone, right? We pretend that the cashier put up the next cash please sign didn't actually do that. I'm not pretending. I'm not saying we pretend our way through this. What I'm saying is that we say, well, what can I do in these situations? What do I actually have control over? And you'll notice that the shock of that experience is that the control we want to have is not the same as the control we do have. Now, like I was saying before, the control we want to have and the underlying premise that we have is that it's easier to change the world than it is to change ourselves. So it's easier for us to say the cashier has done this bad thing and been mean, that the person talking on the phone is talking to somebody specifically because it's going to distract me from my reading. It's easier to say that that's actually what's going on. And to be clear, that very well might be the case. There is no doubt that people are doing and operate in very cruel, malicious, and insensitive ways in our lives. So that's not a made-up thing that we're experiencing. People are sexist, people are racist, people are selfish, all the rest of it. The question is what are we going to do when we face this feeling of being overwhelmed? And earlier I drew the analogy of being overwhelmed and the brick wall. We've come to a brick wall. What do we do? Well, we ask ourselves, what choices do I have? Do I bang on the wall? Do I cry and wail? Do I turn and walk down, going to the right or left, seeing if I can get around the wall? Do I turn back? The idea here is we make other choices that do not undermine our sense of, well, I didn't get the world the way I wanted, so I failed. Because that seems to be the burden that comes up again and again and again. That, for myself, I started out very much, my life as a jazz musician and playing jazz music. And for many years, the idea was that's who I am, right? That's what I do. And then there was a shift to becoming a film editor, composing music for film. And then that was what I do. I was in a long relationship, so that was what I did. And I was a part of that. All of those things have shifted. Some have ended, some have shifted. But they've all changed. The pain that came as a result of those experiences changing was I wasn't able to change with it. The worldview that I had, even if it wasn't entirely clear to me, was still fixed. I wasn't able to accept the process of change. And I talked about this notion earlier, this idea of moving from known to unknown, known to unknown, known to unknown. And I made the analogy that it's like seasons or night and day, lapping water and so on. And that helps me to think of this as, okay, the certainty that I thought a relationship would have, a career would have, a passion would have, that certainty had a known and also had an unknown. And my existing, my living, is coming from the experience of that as a totality. So this is the point I wanted to leave with you today, and maybe I should do another podcast on it, is how feelings of being overwhelmed, as difficult as they are, they reflect a way in which we've seen the world, and that world is changing. In other words, we don't have control over that world, and we're experiencing the uncertainty of that. So how can we see that as something natural, a part of a process, moving from known to unknown, day to night, through the seasons, lapping water and so on? How can we see that also as a potential for change and meaning? And I mentioned this earlier, that we do want change and we do want meaning. We do want purpose. And so the question I'm asking is, does the unknown and is the unknown become this essential part of our own meaning-making process? And so from the cashier to the person talking on the phone, to the indignant coworker, to the relationships that's ended, to the job that we're no longer sure about, is there, as much as there is the unknown, the uncertainty, and the anxiety, is there also a potential? And is that something we can engage? It means reimagining our lives, re-visioning our world. But is it really easier to change the world? Or maybe we can start to explore our world and create and build and reimagine. So until next time, you can find me at jordanoconnor.com. If you have any questions, send me a message. All right. Thank you. Bye for now.